you all very much to all of you for coming to this session. So it's not very often that I sit on a panel that slightly makes me feel slightly starstruck, and hopefully all of you as well. I was not hoping that there'll be a hall of medals here just to evidence the extraordinary sporting talent that we have up here. My name's Dawn Airy, and I've been asked to both chair this conversation, but also to set the scene with a short introduction to the start of another great campaign, which for me is female equality in sport. So I'm going to speak for about 10 minutes, and then we're going to pick up on some of the things that I said within those opening comments, and then we'll have a good time at the end, so you can ask lots of questions of this phenomenal panel. So first of all, I have to say it's wonderful to be back at Girton. I've come here with my eldest daughter, and the first thing she said when we walked in was, "What's that smell?" And I said, that's a smell that's very powerful in Girton. It's called polish, I think. And it hasn't changed since I was first here, which was a really long time ago. But I have to say, it's a double treat to be here today, because not only are we here to celebrate the end of a successful campaign, and a successful campaign that's been led, I think, by an extraordinarily fearless mistress, Susan Smith, who's another great, if not, I would say, one of the greatest mistresses of Girton. I'm hoping there aren't any others in this room that I'm offended, but in fact, the greatest, you're all great. Now, I'm here to talk about the revolution of women's sport, I said, alongside Professor Dame Sarah Springman, Alistair Brownlee, both of whom have competed at the highest level of their sport, and like I said, have an Olympic and elite European triathlon medals to prove it. And I'm also sitting alongside of what you can all close your eyes and Eleanor could just speak and you say, "Oh, I know that woman," a very prominent and really important journalist who also bangs the drum for women on a regular basis. It's a real pleasure and privilege to share this panel. Now, I've got no doubt that their insight into today's discussion will leave you leaving the room with plenty to think about, and wanted to ask them lots of questions around the marquee and drinks this evening. Now, for me, it wasn't a difficult decision when Deborah approached me and to say, "Could you host this panel?" Because it's about a subject that I'm particularly passionate about, and one that continues to create interesting discussion and debate in mainstream media. Now, and forgive me, because I'm going to do terrible generalisations, but if you talk to the average man, there's no average man in this room, on the street to gauge their views on women and their role in sport, you're likely to receive a range of responses from "I don't rate women's sports" to "not as good as the men." Now, not all of the responses, of course, will be negative, but it does infuriate me that we still have to battle outdated views that continue to snowball on social media and really undermine the progress that has been made in so many sports. Now, it's not like women have had the same opportunities as our male counterparts. Mostly, we're playing catch-up, and the constant comparisons are really not apples with apples. And we've made phenomenal progress, that can't be denied. Women have always been underrepresented in sport. And with that, so many girls and women have missed out on the benefits that come with that. Sport builds confidence, it raises aspirations, it plays a key role in a healthy society, both physically and mentally. And even now, with women better represented in so many sports and many governing bodies, now recognising that women need to be and should be invested in, the gap between men's and women's sport is vast. I can't really think of another industry where the gap in inequality is so ridiculously evident. And for me, for you, for society, that should be simple. That should simply be an unacceptable position. And whether that gap is in participation, media coverage, prize funds or pay, it's there. Now, I have to say I'm quite unapologetic about how worked up I can get about this subject. And I've never been shy in sharing my opinions or disquiet. But don't just take my word for it. The stats support these arguments and clearly highlight that women and girls are less physically active than their male counterparts. Just a few examples. 41% of girls aged 7 to 11 years achieve the recommended levels of physical activity. That that means 59% don't. 42% of girls aged 7 to 10, and this is shocking, think boys are better at being strong, despite no evidence whatsoever to support this. And again, that highlights gender stereotyping starting early, that many girls develop deep-rooted negative attitudes from an early age. 64% of girls would quit sport altogether by the time they reach puberty. This coming at a time over their own personal self-esteem and confidence, they probably need sport and physical activity the most. We can attempt to inspire the next generation as much as we can through role models being created within elite sport, but we need to ensure that they know they belong in the supporting landscape and that they can have also a career in sport. But the challenge doesn't stop there, because the gender gap continues into adulthood. Women have less leisure time than men. Women have less leisure time than men. Think about that, ladies in this room. With the UK Office for National Statistics showing that men have 5 hours more leisure time a week than women. 5 hours, that's essentially a gym session or a run after work every working day that women don't have. I don't even know how that's even possible. And it's not just individuals missing out though. 20% more men are involved in team sports, highlighting that so many women are missing out on the benefits of physical activity within a group environment. The friendships, the camaraderie, the wider life skills. Sport provides just so much, and yet so many are missing out compared with their male counterparts. Now, part of this gap in participation could of course be down to visibility. You've all no doubt heard that if you can't see it, you can't be it. But this is another area that shows the gap between men and women's sport. Now, I know what you might be thinking. I see women playing tennis. Well, I don't know whether the ladies' women's final started or over now, but it's on. You see women competing at the Olympics, the current football Euros. Women aren't invisible, but Wimbledon's once a year, and Olympics and Euros every 4. Should we be seeing women competing that infrequently? Of course we shouldn't. The gulf in visibility between men and females, male and female sport, and sporting role models is without doubt an added factor in the participation gap. And there's evidence to show that the impact of visible role models on participation numbers, for example, there's a women's charity called Women's Sport, and they released a very recent report that highlighted how inspirational stories about sporting women can inspire a young girl to practice and play. Of course it can. Separately, the UN stated positive role models are recognised as an important way to increase participation of women and girls in sport and sport leadership. But for so long, with the exception of tennis and athletics, sporting women were invisible on our screens. So how can we create role models if they can't even be seen? And now, before anyone accuses me of being a feminist loudmouth, though hopefully nobody will say that in Girton College, who's here just to talk about hard women habit, I can assure you that's not why I'm here, because the landscape, thank goodness, is changing, and interest in women's sport is growing. Now, I'm seeing this firsthand in one of my many roles, but as chair of the Women's Super League and Championship Board, that oversees the top 2 divisions of women's professional football in England. And since taking on this role 3 years ago, I've seen extraordinary change in the sport. We've got a broadcast deal that sees Sky Sports and BBC show live Women's Super League matches every week, with peak audiences on the BBC averaging regularly over 1 million for last season. Nobody cares about women's sport? Well, the numbers suggest otherwise, if you put it in front of them. 2/3 of UK sports fans now follow women's sport, and half have attended an event. And this despite the hurdles that we have still to overcome. Last month, charity the Women's Sports Trust produced their latest report on the visibility of women's sport, and it was encouraging. Almost 1/3 of the UK population has watched women's sport in 2022, with 21.1 million viewers from January to May this year, compared with 8.8 million at the equivalent stage last year. As I said, put it in front of people and they will watch. And that growth is driven predominantly by the interest in women's professional football, in the Super League, in the Women's Six Nations, and the ICC Women's World Cup. And I'm sure some of you saw, and I know you were probably there commentating on it, Eleanor, how brilliantly the newly launched 100 competition was by the English Cricket Board. Men's and women's cricket being positioned as equal which resulted in extraordinary crowd attendances and interest. So football, because it's particularly close to my heart and what I do, what are we doing with the Super League? Well, we've got a new partnership, as I just said, with the BBC and Sky, and growing and engaging audiences is a key strategic priority. And the two broadcasters have really elevated interest, bringing visibility and analysis that we've never before had in the women's game. We've seen a fourfold increase in viewing hours. We've seen 113% growth in coverage in terms of just hours. And we've seen a growth in female viewers up from a third to 45%. And this all came in the lead up to what is now happening, which is the Women's European Championship, which kicked off this week at Old Trafford in Manchester, to a live playing audience of 68,000 people. And it's going to conclude on the 31st of July at Wembley, where we expect it to be both sold out and the largest crowd ever for an English match in the UK. Now, I will assume that England was getting to the final. I shouldn't have said that, should I? But there we are, we counted it, but for a female soccer match. So that presents us with a great opportunity to really capture the momentum that tournament will generate, with the potential to engage a new audience and really show them the quality of what women's football has to offer. And we saw that momentum after the Women's World Cup in 2019, when the Lionesses reached the semi-finals of the tournament, and we returned to domestic action 6 weeks later. And we had a handful of matches that then played in Men's Stadium to record crowds off the back of that extraordinary semi-final against the States. And we have seen phenomenal numbers, and then, of course, COVID hit, and the world stopped. And certainly, whilst we did continue with the coverage of women's sport, obviously attendances were well down. But we've done a huge amount of work, the FA have done a huge amount of work, feeding into a wide professional game strategy. The FA has never had a women's professional game strategy. It does now. And it has, interestingly, a purpose that's probably different to many other sports. Its purpose of professional football league is to inspire positive change for women and girls in society. It has a higher purpose. And we've got an exciting and collective ambition to develop the best women's league in the world, helping demonstrate strong and healthy role models and inspire girls to play, to coach, to referee, to lead the sport. But we can only achieve that if the sport is visible and viable. And that is why I've been very delighted with the numbers I mentioned earlier, but this is very much the start of closing the gender gap and putting women's sport and women's football truly on the map. And this will apply to many sports. It's not just as a visibility, it needs investment. And football, fortunately, is now beginning to see purpose-driven brands increasingly investing in women's sport too. And it makes commercial sense to get behind the rise of women's sport, because women's sport can help brands demonstrate a unique commitment to equality and inclusion, as well as contributing to bringing about much-needed change for women and girls in society. Revenue generated by women's sport is growing, and in the UK it's anticipated that this will hit the 1 billion mark by 2030, up from the current 350 million a year, making it one of the fastest growing sectors in the sports industry. And women's sport is on a strong growth trajectory, but it's not yet commercially viable. And we won't stop until women and girls have the same opportunities to play, to excel, to thrive, and really importantly, to earn the same amount as their male counterparts. There is no doubt the legacy of historic inequality remains evident, but the pace of change is exciting, and I, for one, will be making as much noise as possible to ensure that this change continues on that upward curve. Now, as I said, I'm loud and I'm proud about the work that is done in women's sport. And whether those of you sitting in this room are male or female, I'd ask you to do the same. Women, support your fellow females and elevate them to help achieve their ambitions. And men, and you already are, and look at you, because you're just on my left, be a male ally. Recognise that women have the talent and drive to be successful, but in some cases, a male voice can play a really important part in changing attitudes of those who continue to stand in their way. Like I said, we've got a brilliant male ally in Annie Brown on our panel today. So thank you for allowing me to sort of set the scene about some of the challenges, the ups and downs, the opportunity for women's sport, and let's now move on to the panel section of this event. And I'm thrilled that we've got Alistair, Sarah and Eleanor on this panel so that we can continue this conversation. So we have so much knowledge and experience and history. Rather than me go to Wikipedia, which is what one often does in these panel sessions, and look at what everybody's done and they send you a resume, you always miss out things. Why didn't they say that about me or whatever? So I'm going to let these three extraordinary panelists tell us about their sporting life, past and present, and what it's meant to them, and then we'll get into some of the issues that I raised around women's sport. So I'm going to kick off, if I may, with Professor Dame Sarah Springman, to tell us about your extraordinary career in sport, although I know you also have an extraordinary career in science. You can talk about that as well. But
no, I won't. Thank you, Dawn. But I'm going to start off. Hello, everybody. It's lovely to be back in the college again, and to see people who I studied with. I can't believe it. It's wonderful. So I started off at school. I was the best all-rounder at school, but I wasn't considered to be good enough material to become the school captain. I eventually, in 2 chunks, represented Cambridge in 11 varsity matches, and out of that won just 1 blue. So had I been a man, it would have been a great many more. And then I went off to Fiji, where I discovered squash and started running and did all sorts of interesting things. That was quite entertaining as a woman in sport, but ended up by leading the Fiji fun run 1 year for at least the first 200 metres, and then ran what was a personal, probably is still my personal best actually. I went under 37 minutes, and I don't know quite how I did it then, but all of this stuff was very early experiences of me as an athlete. And then I came back to Britain, and I did the very first triathlon in this country, the 5th of June 1983, and that changed my life. And I think that you're going to experience that there's a theme here that, you know, Jill of all trades and mistress of none, because I always wanted to be an Olympian. And I was never good enough at swimming or athletics or whatever. I never even put myself into the house 4x100 metre relay because I couldn't run fast enough. All of those things. I'm just trying to cheer all of you up who might think that I've achieved a lot. Yes, I have achieved a lot, but I also have my various crosses to bear. So I then started doing triathlon and eventually won lots of medals. It was very good because at the time I was one of the first ones in. I was clever enough to work out what I needed to do, so I was able to stay ahead of the rest. And I had a period of 5 years when I was completely unbeaten in this country. And do you know what that meant? In year 4, did I sleep the night before a competition? No. When I eventually lost, oh my God, could I sleep before the competition? Yes, I could. So you have various crosses to bear when you face all of that. And I organised low-cost training camps for women in triathlon. I remember 85 was the very first one. 120 people said they wanted to come because they were desperate to try this new sport that was always being talked about as a gruel-a-thon. And I wanted to reduce that and say it's accessible, you can order. I think 80 of them came to Bognor Regis, where we had a wonderful time, and I kept on doing that all the way up until about 1993. So in about 88, the chap who eventually formed the International Federation, with the encouragement of Juan Antonio Samaranch, nabbed me after I'd done the Ironman in Hawaii and kept me out on the street in Alihi Drive for 2 hours in the sun, and I was absolutely knackered. And he was this funny little Canadian trades unionist guy who was telling me I had to represent women in our sport, but he was very persuasive, and so I ended up as the co-chair of the Women's Commission of the International Triathlon Union, which was officially formed after lots of shenanigans in 1989. And unfortunately, I wasn't at the World Championships, which Ali might tell the story of a little bit, even though he wasn't there, but our current president was. And in the process here, I wrote the action plan for women in triathlon, and I only really look back at it and I don't know how I was so wise then, but the words were, and I can tell you exactly, equality of opportunity, everybody has the same chance, recognition, everybody gets the same presentation opportunity and also the same coverage on the telly if we are in control of it, and reward. The prize money is the same. This was a huge fight, I can tell you, for women in triathlon, and that also included athletes, administrators, coaches, and the last three words are probably the most prescient of them all, with the men. And we went into lobbying mode, we sent people to Congress, we produced resolutions, we got things written into the Constitution, and this was accepted then as being the norm, and we had equal number of Olympians, we had the same number of medals for men and women, all of those things, and we lobbied to get the sport into the Olympic Games. I was then vice president of the International Federation. I'm not really quite sure how that happened, but I think the president thought I was less likely to be opposition for him at the time, so it was then easy. And I lobbied to get us into the Commonwealth Games. Then in my second incarnation as a vice president, lobbied to get us into the Paralympic Games and into the mixed relay into the Commonwealth Games, which gold medalists are sitting here on my right in 2014. So that was really interesting again. Two things just about that perhaps. The mixed relay is really important because many national federations didn't develop the sport for women. And this was a very strong encouragement then. If you want to take part in this very accessible event that is actually probably the most exciting in all of the games, I'm absolutely convinced, sorry about football, then you have to develop your young women as well. And so that has a real social impact on doing that. And I think that has been really, really important. When you look at what happens in cycling, and we have a mum of an Olympic medalist here in this room, who's won Olympic medals, won world titles, but what she has been able to earn as a cyclist and the access to the races she's had is an absolute tiny part in comparison with Sir Bradley Wiggins and all of those other chaps who used to represent Sky and whatever. Just one more final point. I was lucky enough to be appointed on the GB Sports Council in '93, just after I was retiring as an elite athlete. And then when we formed the UK Sports Council in 1996, I was an inaugural member of that. So, and then we lent on John Major to say, we need money for the athletes. All jolly good having all of these stadia, but we need the money for the athletes, and you can see what's happened since then. Elliot also has benefited from that. So that was really crucial. And being on the inside, when decisions were being taken, one can ask the question about equality of opportunity and make sure that it's on the agenda of all of the national governing bodies that are coming forward with their plans. And I was the very unpleasant, nasty member of UK Sport who used to ask difficult questions. And I'm happy to say in my second incarnation it was a lot better then, but it's really important. You have to be in there to be able to have the influence, even if you're not the most influential. And I think, looking back on that, probably that Women's Action Plan was absolutely crucial part at the very beginning, and a lot of other people did a lot of other work on it afterwards. But that was the crucial difference between our sport, I think, and other sports like cycling. So.
Thank you, Sarah. Now, I was going to go to Eleanor next, but actually it makes really good sense to follow what Sarah said by passing through to you, Alex, because it would strike me that you've had the benefit of all the extraordinary foundational governance work that Sarah has done in an extraordinary career. I still can't quite. You competed in 11 basket matches, 11 different sports.
Over 7 years.
11.
Yeah, but over 7 years.
She really is superwoman. She really is superwoman. Thank you.
We did win 10 of them.
I don't know. I'm sorry. Ali.
Yeah, I haven't done quite as many sports as Sarah, unfortunately, but there's still time maybe, so I pick up one or two. For me, my sporting journey career started, I guess, as a 6-year-old kid getting taken to the local swimming pool by my mum, who was a swimmer, and taken running by my dad, who was a runner. And for some reason, I was just absolutely obsessed. My dad loves to tell the story of me running around a muddy field in a local cross-country race for the first ever time, and as a doctor thinking he was ready to resuscitate me because I was going so red and looked like I was about to drop dead. He was getting concerned, but for some reason it caught my imagination, and I loved it. And sport, I think, I was obviously trying to do well. I think I was 299, although I keep repeating this figure. I can't find the evidence of it, thankfully, but I was a long way down the field in a lead schools cross-country event, and loved it, and gradually got better and enjoyed it more and more. But I actually think the most important influence sport had on my life at the time was purely the activity. All I can remember from being a young school kid in my primary school and early years of secondary school as being called Alistair's ants in his pants, and yeah, not really achieving academically at all. And when I went to secondary school, a really traditional grammar school, I discovered the cross-country running club, and there'd been a teacher who was there, who had already been there for 30 or 40 years, I think, and took a group of boys, although it became dual sex as I was there, and we became guys and girls, and we'd go out running, and that basically transformed my life. Not only did it allow me to be tired enough in the afternoon to focus on academic activity, I got that wrong sometimes and fell asleep, but most of the time, at least when I was focusing, I was doing much better than I would have done otherwise. It told me that I could work hard at something, I could get better. The harder I worked, the better I got. It told me about setting goals, it told me about going to competitions and trying to do as well as I could. And I really that's the start of me as an athlete, I think. Through my teenage years, I discovered triathlon as well, just before I think I was 10. Not entirely sure when or why that happened either, even though I've been asked probably a million times since. But I was swimming and running and decided to give triathlon a go. Maybe because I'd seen Sarah compete, I don't know. But
I would put it off.
So about that era at the time of the mid-90s, through my teenage years, I just gradually got better and better. I was one of the best runners in the country at the time, and kind of got more and more competitive in triathlon, and firstly in the local region, then nationally, and then internationally. Crucially, when I was 12, triathlon made its debut at the Olympic Games, and all of a sudden, I was interested enough in triathlon to stay up into the middle of the night to watch this my sport as I thought of it, to make its debut in the Olympic Games, and wow, that was an amazing thing. Fast forward a few years after that, I remember clearly being in a careers class at school with the teacher going around the room saying, "Oh, what do you want to do? What do you want to do?" And people saying, "I want to be a brain surgeon or a lawyer, and I want to be a professional triathlete. Is that even possible?" And yeah, I'm not sure, to be honest, but I'd like it to be. So that's at the back end of my school career. And in 2005, London won the bid to host the Olympic Games in 2012 in seven years' time. That was a really big turning point for me. Again, I was at school when I heard they'd won the bid. At the time, it felt almost irrelevant. It was a million miles away to me that I'd even be there, let alone be competing for a medal. But what a fantastic opportunity to go to Olympic Games in a sport that I loved at home. In between then, I was thankfully tired enough at the time to do okay in my academics, and got in and started studying medicine here. And we were talking about it earlier. It was a really, I think a week or two before I started studying, I won the World Junior Champions in Triathlon, and all of a sudden the dream of going to the Olympic Games had become a reality, from someone who was a kind of second-rate international athlete to someone who was now the best of an age group at the time. Again, it was a flick in my head to go, wow, actually, maybe I can be a professional triathlete, maybe I can go to the Olympic Games, maybe I can go to a home Olympic Games. And then I started studying a couple of weeks after, made the decision on advice of my dad, actually. That was one of the best bits of advice I've ever had, which was, well, you've got two fantastic opportunities, effectively. At least give them both a go, because otherwise you might regret it. So I did, and a few months later decided that triathlon and a sporting career was the thing that I really wanted to focus on, and made the decision to focus on that, which again was, I think, probably the most important decision I ever made, because at the time it meant that, and ever since, it meant that I could have always done something differently, and it really focused my mind on being completely committed to my sporting career, which is kind of easy to say, but on a cold, dark winters. January morning in Leeds, sometimes it's difficult to follow through. And I always had this reminding me in the back of my head. So thankfully, in hindsight, that decision turned out to be a good one, and only, I think, 18 months later, I was on the start line for the Beijing Olympic Games as a young, almost nobody, and ended up blowing up after leading the race with about 3 or 4k to go, and coming 12th. But that gave me a massive amount of belief that I could compete with the best in the world. I'd competed with them for, 90% of the triathlon, and it only gone wrong in the last 10%. And the year after that, in 2009, I won the World Series with winning all the events that year, which I don't think anyone's ever done since. And that catapulted me to be a favourite to go into the London Olympic Games, which thankfully went perfectly, and I won with my brother Johnny coming third. Just a quick movement off the story. I don't know if you remember this. I don't know whether it was just before London or it's just after. You were basically lobbying to get the mixed relay in the Olympics at the time. And we're talking to a few IOC members. I think it was maybe Craig, Reedy, and a few. Do you remember? And Sarah says to Johnny and me, "Oh, tell these people why the mixed relay should be in the Olympic Games." And Johnny got in there before me and says, "Because we'll win, because we're the best country." I was like, no, that's not what you're supposed to say, Johnny. So I was trying to be the political one and said, yeah, quality, opportunity, it's fantastic. It'll help and motivate and inspire countries that might not put the emphasis on women's sport to improve it. And anyway, we maybe missed a couple of Olympics out, but we got there in the end. I can blame Johnny for that, but we got there. And we successfully talked to the kind of lobby to get it in the Commonwealth Games together in 2014, which was its introduction to major championships. And I think mixed relay competitions or mixed competitions in endurance sport have become the norm now, but triathlon was definitely the leader in that. And I think as I was reflecting a bit on what to say today, my story in triathlon, because effectively triathlon had complete equality in opportunity and recognition from right at the start, 1989, 1990, it meant effectively it didn't even enter my psyche, and that may sound ignorant, and it is in its way, but it's almost a generation ahead of lots of other sports, I feel. And that's the point of that, is actually a generation, within a generation, it's easy to forget and take for granted things that have happened before you, and the fight, as it were, or the point needs to be made again. And this really struck me actually only a few years ago, as over the last few years I've become more and more interested by sports administration. I was involved in the setup of what is effectively a new form of triathlon, a professional body for long distance triathletes, funded by Silicon Valley money, a really exciting opportunity to be at the start of a new professional sport. And we're having these arguments about, are we going to have equal prize money? Wait a minute, for example, you might have a professional race in Australia in COVID times where people can't get, where you've got 20 men and you've got 3 women. Is it fair that you're paying 3 women and 3 men, etc., etc.? I completely admit, due to my own ignorance, it was probably only at that point that I was thinking, well, these arguments have already been had, people have already been there. The point isn't what's happening on those days, the point is the larger point of driving participation and inclusion around that. And I think then that leads to my something that I do more work on now than anything, which is through a foundation that Johnny and me set up to encourage and drive participation in sport. We've actually had 10,000 young people do a triathlon with us, with our foundation in the last 2 months, which is really cool. But the clear thing is, when you go to these events, is it's completely gender balanced, because I don't think the pupils have got a choice. I think the teachers tell them they're getting on the bus that day from school. So it's definitely not gender balanced by opportunity, it's by force. But I think the thing that's really difficult to watch is you just see in trepidation around lots of young girls around how to act. They're nervous about being in a swimming pool, nervous about throwing on a t-shirt and going outside and cycling. And for me, obviously, as an athlete and believing in the real power of people performing and the inspiration that brings. I think that's more the angle that I've come to from the inclusion point, and that's why I'm really honoured to be here today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ali. I said triathlon has been enlightened over every other sport. As I had the power of you two involved in it right from the beginning. I talked in my opening comments that actually sport is important also for the careers that it can offer. And it doesn't mean that you actually have to be an athlete to have an amazing career in sport. So, Eleanor, I want to talk about your story.
Yes, well, I'm very glad you said that, Dawn, because I absolutely was not an athlete in any sense whatsoever. And you talk about being a little bit sort of starstruck by being on the stand. I mean, I'm massively in awe of Sarah and Alistair for what they've achieved, because I was at the kind of girls' school which was very much, it was very academically focused. There was sport, but if you did not make the first team, then they just forgot about you. There was no effort at all to try and find something that you could do, or something that you might enjoy doing, or something you might feel confident doing. And I see people nodding their heads in recognition of that. And Sarah, the fact that you said that you were in 11 varsity matches, but you still had this sense that you were not good enough, that you were never good enough, and you had to find something that was for you. And so effectively triathlon became your thing. I mean, I absolutely love that, and I wish that I'd had that. I mean, I might still not have been particularly good, but I would probably have enjoyed it, and sport would have been part of my life in a taking part sense. But actually sport has been the key part of my life really in a career sense, because I work for the BBC. I've worked for the BBC for 30-something years now, and I was, I think, the first regular presenter of sport on BBC Radio. I was the first person to present Sports Report back in 1996, which is the flagship Saturday afternoon sports programme. I've been to 11 Olympic Games, summer and winter, and did the Tokyo Olympic Games in a studio in Salford, as an awful lot of people did, sadly. And I've done a number of Commonwealth Games. I'm going to the Birmingham Commonwealth Games in a couple of weeks' time. I now cover cricket around the world, which was my dream really. When I was 15, I wanted to be a cricket journalist, because I grew up in a very sports-orientated family. My two brothers, my father, and in fact my mother, who's sitting here in the second row, all loved sport or watched sport all the time. So it was just ingrained that sport was a very important part of family life. And so cricket became my obsession when I was in my teens. And I remember we're going to a school reunion 20 or so years ago, and somebody saying, yes, I remember you were quite interested in sport, but you used to walk around all the time carrying this big, thick yellow book, which cricket fans would know as Wisden's Cricketer's Almanac, which is packed full of boring statistics. So I was very odd as a teenager. But the fact that I've been given these opportunities to be a sports broadcaster, to be a journalist over this length of time, it literally did all start here, and it probably started just down the corridor and slightly over to the right, because in my first year at Girton, I wanted to be, my friends knew I wanted to be a sports journalist, and my friend Katrina, who was also sitting in the second row, said you should talk to Anne Meerwood, who was the sports editor of what was then Stop Press, is now Varsity, because she is the sports editor of Stop Press. I mean, this is remarkable. You think about this in 1981, that there was a woman doing that role, as a journalist, writing about sport, even just student journalism. So anyway, I spoke to Anne, and she said, yes, of course. Well, I do all the cricket, so you can't do the cricket, so it's fine. I'm a mere fresher, so I'm not even going to try and argue that point. So she said, but you can go and cover the men's hockey team. So went down to, I think I must have played at Fennis, wrote a report, it appeared in Stop Press, and I remember going into Post, and there was this big pile of Stop Presses, and I picked it up and I thought, oh my God, people are going to read this and think, what is she talking about? She knows nothing about hockey. What right does she have to write about sport in any publication? And actually, so I was literally expecting people to thrust this in my face and say, you are an imposter. But of course it didn't happen. But that imposter syndrome, I think, lasted till about 10 years ago. because in a way, you know, even though I was doing it, there was still that feeling of judgment from the world around, from the male world around, I think. This idea that actually, you know, I didn't really have a right to talk about football or cricket or rugby. And it was mostly men's sports in those days that we were doing, certainly in the early part of my career. And women's sport has become, as Dawn has told you, so much. I mean, it's come on so much in the last 10 years or so. But that is something that is very hard to shake, and I think it infects women in so many careers and in so many areas of life, that imposter syndrome. But I just want, I want to kind of take questions and talk about other topics as well. But I wanted to say actually that that the most successful sports person in my family is in fact my mother, because she coxed the women's 8, the Cambridge Women's 8, in 1952, 53. And I said to her, I might mention this. She said she was an imposter. But she said, when I said this to her, she said, well, there were 8 oarswomen in the whole university, and I was the cox. And in fact, Oxford couldn't raise an 8 that year, so there actually wasn't a boat race that year, was there? But you competed in different events and coxed on the tideway and so on. But anyway, so she has a half blue. I didn't get anywhere near a half blue, and now you get a full blue. I think probably wouldn't you for Rome. So that's pretty much my story. But very, you know, other things. Male allies incredibly important. I had some very enlightened bosses when I first started out in 1984. When I first went to work in local radio when I came down from here, who when I said I want to cover cricket, said, "Of course, off you go. You can go and do it. Of course you can do it." And so I had those people believing in me at that stage. And now I feel it's really important to try and help women who are starting out in their career as well. And it's something that I'm very keen to do, to have people come to me. So if any of you know of women, have daughters, granddaughters who have aspirations to a career in sports journalism, then put them in touch with me, because I'm very keen to get the next generation moving through and doing what I've loved to do for the last 30 years.
Thank you. So 3 very different, yet very familiar stories. Now, at this point, I was going to ask the panel for one other question, which is, what do you think the very live issues are in women's sport at the moment? But actually, we touched upon them. We touched on access, exposure, fair pay. And I'm conscious that we've got 15 more minutes in this session, so I think we should open it up for questions, because you have this extraordinary set of experiences represented by the folks on this panel. So I'd like to throw it to the floor so that you've got your chance to get stuck in and ask some questions. So, are you using the microphone? Thank you.
Hi, I'm not a Girtonian. My wife was a Girtonian. I think you met her earlier, Sarah. Question for you, Dawn. I think you said something along the lines earlier, before someone accuses me of being a loudmouth feminist. And I'd just like to know, what's wrong with that?
Very good recall. So what's wrong with that? Absolutely bugger all. But some people do object. But I appreciate the sentiment behind your very easy question. Thank you.
Can I just give I think one of the things that was very clear to me was that if you were a radical feminist, that was the generation that came just before me, and I'm very definitely a loudmouth feminist, but I was able to build on the radical lot that made all the men go like this or whatever, to then create opportunities for others. So I think the feminist word is great, it's fantastic, but I think it's how you use that, again, with the men, and it works quite well.
And I think the landscape has changed a lot as well. So when I started out, it was a very sexist place, as you can imagine, the world of sport. I'm not even, tell stories that would make your hair melt, but I'm not going to. But now, I think there was a point actually when there was a presenter on Sky called Charlotte Hawkins, and she was not quite touched up in the studio, but borderline touched up in the studio by a couple of male colleagues. and she called it out, and I thought, good for you, because it changed, that changed so much, because up to that point people did not call it out. You know, you smiled, you know, you behaved as if this was a compliment, but you just did not stand up for it. But now the way that women call things out is hugely powerful, and that's changed. That's one of the great changes that we've seen.
I mean, I have my daughter, my eldest daughter with autism, and she'll kill me for saying this. But when I tell her about tales, in my early career in broadcasting, she says, well, why on earth did you put up with that? Because the truth is the millennials and centennials will not put up with what we have to put up with, and that's progress, and that's a great thing. Other questions, please? I think there's a lady.
My sport is sailing, where there isn't really a distinction between men's and women's sport. But inevitably, once you get to a stage where you no longer wish to actively participate and you want to move into race management, being race officials, etc., sailing is an activity where there are a lot of women in supportive roles in race management teams, but very, very few actually in leadership roles and being race officers, etc. Now, I know there have been campaigns like This Girl Can, but I'm not really seeing that that is effective in terms of getting people to move up the sort of race official scale. Not necessarily at elite level, but at good participative level. So have you got any comments on that?
So I'm going to slightly repeat your questions. This has been recorded, and I've been told when we answer with making reference to the question, so it's called. So, question being how sports present, how they can best present opportunities once you've been active in sport in terms of support as well. Correct. So, would you like to, Ali, have a go at that one?
I'll go. I've recently been conducting some academic research actually to try and answer this question specifically in triathlon, so looking across the different pillars, participation, athletes competing, governance, technical officials and coaches, looking at which countries around the world have good gender equality across those pillars, and then the next bit is trying to look into what those countries have done well to get to that point. That's the point of the qualitative research we haven't done yet. But yeah, you can see it's an issue. You can see countries do it well, and some funny things have actually come out of it. Things like, for example, gender-only events haven't driven particularly good improvements in inclusion, inclusion for participation, and I think governance, for example, but specific ways in larger events are quite good, because I think they promote the fact that you've got everyone there on a day, but maybe allow people who'd be nervous to be in a triathlon centre, a wave with men, allow them their own space to do it. So I think it's kind of quite a nuanced argument, and I don't know that much about technical officials, to be honest. Sarah will know more.
No, I can probably do something on that. One of the things I think is really important is you have to see it to be it. So when you have the Olympic Games or the Commonwealth Games or whatever, do you see the same number of male and female international technical officials? And are they the referees or whatever? And by the way, I think the chief executive of sailing is a woman, Sarah, and I can't remember her surname. So, but she's been doing it for, so people need to be seen. And I think if you then have a 50-50 split of the international technical officials, and then you make it a big theme in your international federation that therefore, in order to have a chance to have a technical official in one of these games, it's jolly helpful if you then develop your best women, and then you have a regional system below all of that. Then you can start getting people coming up through, but you need to be very proactive, and you probably need a few quotas as well in order to get it running. And the problem is, if you don't have quotas, actually, I'm not sure that it ever remains completely embedded. So I think that's how you have to do it, and perhaps sailing should look at that too.
Hello, yes. My question is similar, but goes down a bit more deeper to lower age groups. So I've observed that in the primary and the secondary school, as children move, and with girls, in the primary school, sports facilities, to whatever level they're provided, are almost compulsory and mandatory. But as the children go up to the secondary school, it becomes compulsory / optional. And in optional, it's what I have noticed is like a change from active sports to what is called gym, which to most of the girls at that point is quite a nice session to sit down, catch up, or walk at, I don't know, less than 1 mile on the treadmill, and it's all fine. Now, where I'm going with this is that when we talk about female visibility and participation, we always talk about how many have made it to be visible, which we are talking county, regional, or teams personally. We are not talking about that age of 11 to 18, which is a long age time in a girl's life, where obviously puberty is hitting, body images come into being, consciousness is there, and body shapes change. At that point, when we are giving them an option to not do active sports, are we not stopping the new crop or new generation, or not encouraging them enough? Because we don't almost seem to like have an army. We have the 1 or 2 generals, but what is the 4? Where's the army? Where are all those girls who can be encouraged to combat during that age of 11 and 18 to be more body confident, which is almost the same thing as said, that getting into the swimsuit, putting on a t-shirt, putting on a pair of leotards, and your shapes are changing. So I would like to know the panel's view of how these little girls can be helped or encouraged so that we can be more visible. Thank you.
Thank you. So the question being, how during your education that sport remains germane, a core central part of your education, all the way through to when you leave school. Because like I say, primary school, it is provided, but it's very generalist, and then it becomes optional in secondary school. I personally couldn't agree with you anymore. I think education in this country is pretty woeful in certain areas, and I say that in an educational establishment. But you're absolutely right that women, young girls, should be active in sport for all of the positive reasons that we've discussed on this panel, but it's not mandated. And for me, it should be as important as doing math, English. It's a core subject and life skill for all of the benefits that you said. But
yeah, well, I mean, as a fellow mother of daughters, I mean, you know, and my children are now in their early 20s, so they've been through that school cycle, and they were lucky that they went to a school which had a very strong sporting tradition, because it had been a boys' school, and so the girls were just encouraged to take part as well. But they both dropped out. Yeah, they were both quite good, and they both had, you know, my elder daughter rowed, my younger daughter was good at netball. But I think that you put your finger on the question of when bodies are changing, that kind of body image part of things, which I think actually somebody mentioned the This Girl Can campaign, which Sport England ran, which I thought was so powerful, because it showed a lot of women running around having fun, just giving it a go, just running slowly, you know. So I think one of the slogans was, I may be slow, but I'm faster than the people who are sitting on the couch. And one of them was a bunch of women at a Zumba class, and the tagline was, sweating like a pig, feeling like a fox. And just that message of the endorphins that sport gives you and the enjoyment that it gives you, I think an awful lot of women miss out on that. And I think at elite level as well, one of the most important bits of research which has been done, or one of the most important debates which has come out recently, is the idea of women not being forced to wear white sports kit all the time because of their menstrual cycles. And for years there was no research done, no work done on a scientific level of how menstruation affects sporting performance, or how, you know, all sports science was based on a male model. you know, I'm not a male model obviously, but on the model of a male physique. So that has changed hugely. But I think another thing as well is just this idea that men, when they leave school or when they go through school, they'll leave school, they'll join a club, and they can be rubbish at football, and it doesn't matter because they're having fun and they're enjoying themselves, or they can go and join a cricket team and they might field on the boundary the whole time, they might get out first ball every time, but they're part of the fun of it. And for women to be able to say, I don't mind if I'm a bit crap, I'm still going to do it because it's going to be fun and it's going to make me feel good. I think that is a really important message, that if we can get that through to our daughters, then that will take us a long way, in not just participation, the health of the country that you mentioned, Dawn, but also potentially a next generation of athletes as well, if we think that kind of thing is important.
Yeah, I think your point is absolutely valid. The drop-off that you see female sports and athletes doing stuff up to 16 is shocking, and whenever you see the statistics, it's awful. And at the same time, you know, we see all these statistics and health stuff about basically your activity levels and health at that age at 16 as a massive determinant on the rest of your life. If you get to 16 and you're unhealthy and overweight, you're probably going to struggle on those nasty diseases once you get further on. So not only is it trying to get people up to the top, the generals, as you said, doing elite sport, but it's a whole health, active lifestyle, you know, massive society issue. I kind of flip it a bit on its head though, in terms of I think it's opportunities as much as anything, and I'd say that opportunities to play team sport, to do what they want to do in the way that they want to do it. And I think in that sense it is a male and female issue, providing opportunities to, because people like doing different things at different times in different ways with different people. And yet, to use an example, of course, we can't mandate young people to go at 3 miles an hour on the treadmill instead of 1, or 4 miles an hour, or do it a bit longer and not be able to chat. But we can say, actually, you've got to do an activity you enjoy 3 times a week in a certain form, and I think that's the way to go about it.
Please.
Wendy Savage, I was at Girton 70 years ago, and I played hockey and swam. My question is, as the evidence is that going through male puberty gives stronger adults, should it be right for men to compete if they become trans women? Should those trans women be treated in the same way as women who are born female? And it seems to me that the idea of having a separate category so that you don't just have male and female, but you have trans, would be a way of dealing with that advantage that comes to women, trans women. And I wonder if that is going to happen. When we have the Paralympics, and obviously the proportion of people who are trans in the population is nothing like as great as those who are disabled. But clearly something has to be done about this, and somebody mentioned evidence in the room this morning, and I think this is an element in this room that we do need to look at this problem. Otherwise, women who are born as biological females are not going to ever get to the top of that profession on their sport. Is that competing against people with this biological part?
Thank you for that question, which is, for those who couldn't quite hear at the front, was the whole transgender question and the equality that represents, particularly in elite sport. You were saying elephant in the room. This is the best question for last. In some ways, that isn't to undermine the question we had previously. But it's 4:30. I'm really thrilled that you asked that question because we sort of thought it would come up. So I'm going to ask Sarah to kick off, please.
Thank you very much, Wendy. Great question. Good news is Triathlon announced this week that there will be a separate wave for people in that category. because it's following on from a lot of consultations at Sports Council level where people have tried to unpick what is the right way forward. And there was also a survey from British Triathlon on do you believe in participation or in performance, and how can you include every single person on this earth, whether they're trans or not, to be able to do their sport. But what happens then in terms of fairness when you are competing at a performance level? So triathlon has come down on the side of biological women will compete in the women's categories, and I think that's what's happening also in swimming, and will probably come through in athletics and various other sports. I think the IOC has been absolutely useless, again, unfortunately. They've done this time and again. They did it with drugs the other time. So don't let me be too nasty about the IOC. But I think that is a way of doing it. And you want people to be included. And who knows, maybe in the future there'll be a Trans Olympics. I don't know. The only challenge we have with that is putting the Paralympics 2.5 weeks after the Olympics. Is it actually generally a huge cost, in a sense, to the host city? And so I can't see that then 2.5 weeks after that, or in between those, that you would have a Trans Olympics. I think that a little bit is the challenge at the moment. But let's build the sport, let's build the participation opportunities for these athletes, and then we can see where that might end up with performance opportunities for them. Certainly, at a level of a national federation, you can give out medals for national champions and all of the rest of it. It's just this very top level at the Commonwealth and the Olympic Games and so on, or the world. So supra-international federation, that it might fail at the moment.
Thank you. Okay, so work in progress. I mean, what I would say with my football hat on is, you know, like Sarah in sports that she's touched upon, one football team for all, male, female, transgender, either way. But this is a hugely both emotive topic and very live topic that everyone is trying to get to the right outcome on. So it's very much work in progress, but I think if we got together in 2 years' time, there'll be far greater clarity and direction about how to deal with that really important question that you raised, for which I thank you. We're 5 minutes over, but if there's any last burning question, please.
I was just going to say, what is a woman in sport these days?
What is a woman in sport? That's an existential crisis for a drink later. So, are you all happy to stay on a bit longer? Is that all right, Carolina? I'm assuming so. Okay.
You can do short answers for this. Thanks, guys. First of all, thank you very much. It's been absolutely very thought-provoking and enlightening talk, so thanks a lot. My question is, and it's sort of an observation as well as a question, we've got a great, interesting panel. I would say some of the most positive comments about the current situation came from Alistair, and you attributed that a little bit to the fact that triathlon is your primary sport. I was considering in my own head, is it because you're the boy on the panel or the male on the panel? But I actually think there could be a generational thing as well. So my question is, it's a simple, you can keep short answers. I'm hoping for a positive response. Is it getting better, and how much has it improved over your lifetimes, your generations?
I can go from there. It's all right.
As the oldest, yes, it's much better. Well, I am the oldest. So the answer is yes, it's hugely better. And what those radical feminists did all those years ago have made it possible for people like me to come along. I'm old hat now, and passing on to the next generation. And we're seeing definitely men as allies, and it's absolutely wonderful. I've been goggling at the cricket, women's cricket, at the women's football, all of those things. And I've even seen some women's rugby recently, because I've been out in Switzerland where they follow these things quite so much. And it's absolutely splendid. And I've seen careers for women as coaches. We've still got a lot more work to do there, but it's definitely getting better. But we can't stop, because if we do stop, it'll slide back. And so we need all of you to carry on working in your spheres. It's just like you throw the little stone in the pond and it ripples out. And everybody needs to do that. And then we have lots of ripples and we make progress.
Yeah, it's definitely getting better. I think on terms of the international super level, as Sarah was saying, participation, more technical officials, more opportunity, equal prize money, seeing more women's sport outside of triathlon TV. absolutely massive difference. I think I'd finish on an anecdote. You know, I've cycled on the same roads my entire life, effectively, since I was an 8-year-old in Yorkshire, and going back 20 years, I would know by name every single woman cyclist I saw, because they were pretty serious cyclists. Not, she was just a bit before my time, but yeah. Well, yeah, and absolutely, actually, it's very hard to talk about women in sport without talking about barrel bursting. She should be talked about more. But yeah, now see hundreds of women out cycling in groups, you know, all the time, and I think it is an anecdote, but it's an important one as well, because it's a sport that isn't necessarily it's very backwards in terms of women's participation. There's lots of issues around, you know, potentially safety, doing it on your own, etc., etc., and that's been an enormous change, especially in the last 10 years.
Yes, I'm sorry, I hope you don't think I've been at all negative, because actually I feel very, very positive, and I love doing this panel, because if we'd done this panel, you talk about doing things in 2 years' time, if we'd done this panel 10 years ago, it would have been all about the challenges, it would have been all about the barriers still in place for women at the elite level to get on the media as well. So the fact that we had 68,000 people at Old Trafford the other day for England against Austria in the Women's Euros is massive. The fact that the 100 was such a success story in terms of getting, I mean, you know, this is a controversial thing for the cricket purists, but in terms of getting women's cricket on the same playing field as men, literally, that was a huge success story. The fact that you've got so many household names now in women's team sports, because individually women's sport has never struggled. You know, people didn't know who Billie Jean King was, but she was obviously fought her own battles. You know, so in tennis, in athletics, and so on, those were household names, but not in team sports. And actually, I heard a discussion on Radio 5 Live this morning about the fact that for the Euros in 2005, the press officers for the individual teams had to phone up newspaper sports desks and beg them to write something, saying, these are the results of the games up till now, please will you print them? And now the top writers, the top journalists, you know, the main broadcasters are not only showing women's football, women's team sports, but competing for the rights to show it as well. And when you've got that competition for TV rights, when it's a product that people want to buy, that is a big step forward, and that's happened in the last 10 years, in my experience.
So I think the answer, I'm going to echo what has been said by fellow panellists, is profound change, positive change. I still think there's a hell of a way to go, unfortunately, and I don't think that work will be done in terms of true parity in my lifetime. I'd love to think it was, I'm not so sure. Now, I'm just going to say that's the last question, but there's a lady who's been very patient in the third row. So that really is the last question, and the rest will pick up. It will be social afterwards.
It's as much a comment but a question. The great leveller in terms of men and women's sport is to have 4 legs. Because for quite a number of years now, particularly in the equestrian world, horse racing is catching up with it. But there have been men and women competing on equal terms, and very successfully, in particularly, you've got eventing, show jumping, Yorkshire leading the way on that, and in dressage. So it's a final thought that sometimes the levelling has been happening, but almost surreptitiously, because people have not perhaps given credit enough to the 4 legs, as well as the people sitting on top of them.
It's a lovely way to round off this panel. God bless the 4 legs. Thank you all very much for being so engaged. Thank you.